For 40 years, a British farmer could work the same soil his grandfather worked, build something worth millions, and hand it to his children without the government taking a single penny. That promise just died. And the people who broke it didn't just change a tax rate, they pulled the rug out from under an entire way of life. And most of the country still doesn't understand what's about to happen to the food on their table. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a time long before Rachel Reeves ever stood at a dispatch box. For more than 4 decades, British inheritance law treated farmland differently from almost every other kind of wealth. If you owned shares, a second home, a business, or savings, the taxman would eventually take a slice when you died. But farmland was different. It was protected by something called agricultural property relief, alongside a cousin policy called business property relief. Together, these two reliefs meant that a working farm, no matter how large, no matter how many millions it was worth on paper, could pass from one generation to the next completely free of inheritance tax. The logic behind this was simple and, for a long time, widely accepted. Farms are not like other businesses. A farmer cannot simply liquidate a field the way a shareholder can sell stock. The land is the business. The land is the home. The land is the pension, the inheritance, and the livelihood, all rolled into one immovable asset. Sell the wrong field, and you might lose the grazing your livestock depends on, or the acreage your entire rotation of crops has been built around for decades, forcing families to sell parts of a working farm every single generation just to pay a tax bill would, over time, fragment farms into smaller and smaller pieces, undermining food production and destroying rural communities. So governments of every political stripe left this relief largely untouched for over 40 years. To really appreciate what was lost, it helps to picture how a typical farming family actually experiences wealth. Most people think of being a millionaire as having £1 million sitting somewhere accessible in a bank account, in shares, in something you could theoretically spend tomorrow if you wanted to. Farming wealth almost never works that way. A farmer's fortune is locked inside soil, fences, barns, tractors, combine harvesters, grain stores, and livestock. None of it can be spent on daily life. None of it produces a salary in the way a normal job does. Instead, it produces a modest annual income from selling crops or livestock, an income that has to cover fuel, seed, fertilizer, veterinary bills, equipment repairs, staff wages, and the countless unpredictable costs that come with working the land and depending on the weather. For decades, the one saving grace of this arrangement was that farmers didn't have to worry about the government taxing the very asset that made their business possible, the land itself, the moment it changed hands between generations. Take that protection away, even partially, and you introduce an entirely new kind of financial pressure into an industry that already runs on thin margins and long hours. That era ended on the 30th of October 2024. In her first autumn budget as Chancellor, Rachel Reeves stood up and announced a fundamental rewrite of the rules. From April 2026, the unlimited exemption would be gone. In its place would be a cap. The first £1 million of combined agricultural and business property would still receive full 100% relief. But anything above that threshold would only receive 50% relief, which in practice meant an effective tax rate of 20% on everything over the line. 20% might sound modest next to the standard 40% inheritance tax rate that applies to most other assets in Britain. And that was exactly the argument the Treasury made. They said this was still a generous discount. They said it would only affect the wealthiest estates, the ones exploiting a loophole rather than the ones actually farming the land for a living. But farmers heard something very different. They heard a death sentence for a way of life that had defined entire regions of this country for centuries. And when you actually run the numbers on a typical working farm, it becomes obvious why the reaction was so visceral. Consider the analysis published by the Country Land and Business Association, one of the most respected rural advocacy groups in Britain. They looked at a completely ordinary 200-acre arable farm, the kind you'd find scattered across Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, or the Cotswolds. A farm like that might generate an annual profit of around £27,000, not a fortune, barely above a modest salary in many parts of the country. Yet because of how land values have exploded over the past 2 decades, that same farm's total asset value, the land, the buildings, the machinery, the equipment, could easily exceed several million pounds on paper. Under the original £1 million threshold, a farm like that could be facing an inheritance tax bill of £435,000. To put that number into perspective, the CLA calculated that this would equal 159% of the farm's entire annual profit, every single year, for 10 consecutive years. In other words, even if that farm devoted every single penny of profit toward the tax bill, with nothing left over for the family to live on, nothing for reinvestment, nothing for emergencies, it still wouldn't be enough. The math simply does not work. This is the trap at the heart of the story. Farmers are, in the words repeated again and again by industry leaders, asset rich but cash poor. The land is worth a fortune. The bank account is not, and you cannot pay a tax bill with a field. It's worth pausing on why farmland became so valuable in the first place, because that context matters enormously to understanding the fairness debate. Over the past 2 decades, agricultural land prices in Britain have climbed dramatically, far outpacing general inflation and, in many years, outpacing house prices too. Some of that increase reflects genuine agricultural economics, demand for food production, government subsidies shifting toward environmental schemes, and the sheer scarcity of usable farmland on a crowded island. But a meaningful part of that price surge has also been driven by exactly the kind of buyer the reform was originally targeting. Wealthy individuals and institutions purchasing farmland not to grow anything, but purely as a long-term store of value, a hedge against inflation, and crucially, a vehicle to shelter enormous fortunes from inheritance tax entirely. When outside money floods into a limited supply of land, prices rise for everyone, including the family that has genuinely farmed that same patch of Yorkshire or Devon for 5 generations and has no interest whatsoever in tax planning. That family simply wakes up one day to discover their farm's paper value has multiplied several times over, even though nothing about how they run the business has changed at all. Their income hasn't grown, their costs haven't shrunk. But suddenly, on paper, they look wealthy enough to be caught by a tax designed for people in a completely different financial position. The human stories that emerged in the weeks after the budget made the abstract numbers feel real. Take Edward Stevens, who farms cereal and dairy near Whitchurch in Hampshire. His farm, which he describes as small, sits on around 300 acres. He runs the business alongside his 20 foo. Our year-old cousin and his 90-year-old grandmother, all 3 of them partners in the enterprise. Stevens estimated that his farm could be valued at somewhere between 6 and 7 million pounds, once you account for the land, the dairy herd, the buildings, and the equipment. Under the new rules, that valuation could translate into a tax bill approaching £1 million. Think about what that actually means in practice. A 90-year-old woman, a young man in his 20s, just starting his working life, and a farmer trying to keep a dairy operation afloat, suddenly facing the prospect that when the eldest partner passes away, the family might be forced to sell off chunks of a farm that has supported them for generations, not because the business failed, not because they mismanaged anything, but simply because the value of the land itself triggered a tax bill they have no way to pay in cash. Then there's Richard Payne, a farmer in Somerset, who made headlines when he told the BBC that he had already advised his own son to look for a career outside of farming altogether, not because his son lacked passion for the land, not because the family didn't want the tradition to continue, but because Payne genuinely believed the business would become completely unviable once the new tax rules took hold. Read that again. A father telling his own child not to inherit the family trade because the government had made it financially impossible to do so. That is the emotional core of this entire story, and it's the reason tens of thousands of farmers eventually took to the streets of London in protest. Tractors rolling past Parliament, banners reading messages like, "Stop killing the people who feed you," a blunt and furious response from a community that felt blindsided and betrayed. What struck many observers about those protests was how unusual they were. British farmers are not, historically, a group known for marching through central London in large numbers. Farming communities tend to be geographically scattered, fiercely independent, and more likely to quietly get on with the job than to organize mass demonstrations. The scale of the turnout, tractors lined up for streets, farmers traveling down from Scotland, Wales, and the furthest corners of England, was itself a signal of just how existential the threat felt to the people living it. For many of these families, this wasn't an abstract policy debate about tax efficiency or treasury revenue targets. It was a direct threat to something they had spent their entire adult lives building, often following in the footsteps of parents and grandparents who had done exactly the same thing before them. The National Farmers Union, representing the interests of farming families across England and Wales, did not mince words either. They called it a disastrous budget for family farms. They warned it would strip away the next generation's ability to keep producing British food. And it wasn't just farmers speaking out. Public figures with genuine skin in the game joined the chorus too. Broadcaster and farmer Jeremy Clarkson, who has spoken publicly about how the old inheritance tax relief was a significant factor in his own decision to buy farmland in Oxfordshire, criticized the changes alongside television presenter Kirsty Allsop, both arguing the government simply did not understand what mattered to people living and working in rural Britain. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where you have to separate the political rhetoric from the actual policy detail. The government's central justification for these changes was never really about ordinary working farms at all. It was about a loophole. For years, tax advisors and wealth managers had been quietly telling extremely wealthy clients, people with no interest, whatsoever in actually farming, that buying agricultural land was one of the most effective ways to shelter a fortune from inheritance tax entirely. Because the old relief had no cap, no ceiling, and no limit, a billionaire could purchase a sprawling estate purely as a tax avoidance vehicle, let someone else run the farming operation, and pass that entire fortune down to their children completely tax-free. Organizations like Tax Justice UK had spent years highlighting exactly this pattern, arguing that genuine working farmers were being squeezed out of the land market by wealthy outsiders who were driving up prices purely for the tax benefit, not because they had any interest in growing wheat or raising livestock. From the Treasury's perspective, capping the relief was about closing that loophole while still protecting what they described as the vast majority of genuine farms. Officials repeatedly pointed out that the £1 million threshold sat on top of existing separate inheritance tax allowances, meaning a farming couple could often shield a house worth up to £1 million through completely different exemptions before even touching the agricultural relief. The government's own estimate was striking. They claimed the changes would only ever affect around 500 estates a year across the entire country. Just 500. That is a vanishingly small fraction of the roughly 200,000 or so farm holdings that exist in the UK. But farming organizations flatly rejected that figure. The National Farmers Union and the Country Land and Business Association put the real number far higher, estimating that as many as 70,000 farms across Britain could eventually fall above the EHE threshold and become liable for the new tax. That is an enormous gap between the government's estimate and the industry's estimate, and it became one of the most heated points of dispute throughout the entire debate. Why such a massive discrepancy? Largely because of how dramatically farmland values have risen over the past 20 years. A farm that might have been worth a few £100,000 a generation ago can now be valued in the millions, not because the farming business itself became more profitable, but simply because land prices soared, driven partly by genuine agricultural demand and partly by exactly the kind of wealthy non-farming buyers the government said it was trying to target in the first place. In other words, the very trend the reform was designed to curb, outside money flowing into farmland, had already inflated the value of ordinary working farms to the point where many of them now looked, at least on paper, like the wealthy estates the policy was aimed at. Rural advocates warned this would create a genuinely perverse outcome. If family farms are forced to sell portions of their land to cover tax bills, who is actually going to buy that land? Matt Riddington, a farmer and farm consultant based in Lincolnshire, put it plainly when he warned that wealthier farmers and outside investors could end up hoovering up more land, potentially buying up smaller parcels sold off by struggling families. Instead of curbing the concentration of farmland in fewer, wealthier hands, critics argued the policy could actually accelerate it, pushing small and medium family farms out of business while consolidating land into ever larger operations. Some analysts also pointed out that land freed up through forced sales often doesn't stay agricultural at all. It gets bought for housing development or converted into renewable energy projects like solar farms, permanently removing it from food production altogether. For a country that already imports a significant share of its food, and where questions about long-term food security have become increasingly urgent, that possibility alarmed policymakers and farming communities alike. There's also a slower, quieter consequence that rarely makes headlines, but worries people deeply embedded in the industry: the effect on the next generation's willingness to even try. Farming has always been a difficult sell to young people. The hours are long, the financial rewards are modest compared to many other careers, and the work is physically demanding in a way that office jobs simply are not. For a long time, the one compensation was security, the knowledge that if you devoted your life to the family farm, you would eventually inherit something real, something that had been built up over generations, without the government stepping in at the final moment to claim a share of it. Remove that certainty, and you remove one of the last remaining incentives that kept young people choosing agriculture over almost any other career path. And when a father like Richard Payne tells his own son to look elsewhere, that is not just one family's private decision. Multiply that sentiment across thousands of farming households, and you start to see a genuine risk to the long-term pipeline of people willing to take on this kind of work at all. For well over a year after that original October 2024 announcement, the farming community lived under a cloud of genuine uncertainty. Protests continued. Lobbying intensified. The Country Land and Business Association actively encouraged its members to write directly to their local members of parliament to invite them out to visit their farms in person and to share their personal story. Arguing that the human impact of this policy simply could not be captured by spreadsheets and Treasury statistics alone. Even within the governing Labour Party itself, cracks began to show. MPs representing rural constituencies were reportedly uneasy about the political cost of the policy, aware that opinion polling consistently showed significant public sympathy for farmers, even among voters who had no personal connection to agriculture whatsoever. And then, just before Christmas, on the 23rd of December 2025, the government blinked. In a significant reversal, the Treasury announced it would raise the threshold for full relief from £1 million all the way up to £2.5 million. This was not a minor tweak. It represented a 2.5 times increase in the amount of agricultural and business property that could pass completely tax-free. On top of that, the government made a second crucial change. It confirmed that any unused portion of that allowance could now be transferred between spouses or civil partners after death, functioning in a similar way to how the standard nil rate band already worked for ordinary inheritance tax. Under the old rules, farming couples often had to engage in complicated and sometimes risky estate planning, deliberately splitting ownership of assets and timing gifts carefully between spouses purely to make sure both of their individual allowances got used. The new transferability rule removed much of that complexity. Taken together, these two changes meant that a married couple, or a couple in a civil partnership, could now pass on up to £5 million worth of combined qualifying agricultural and business assets to their children without a penny of inheritance tax being due. The government's messaging around this reversal was notably upbeat. Treasury officials stated that they had listened carefully to the concerns raised by the farming community and had decided to go further to protect what they called more ordinary family farms, while still holding on to the core principle that the very largest and most valuable estates should not receive unlimited relief forever. According to the government's own updated projections, around 85% of estates claiming agricultural property relief in the 2026 to 2027 tax year would now end up paying no inheritance tax at all under the revised threshold. That is a dramatic shift from the anxiety and anger that defined the initial announcement 14 months earlier. This new higher threshold became law when the Finance Act 2026 received royal assent on the 18th of March 2026, formally locking the revised rules into the statute books. And then, right on schedule, on the 6th of April 2026, the new system finally came into force. So as things stand today, the operative rule is not the £1 million figure that originally sparked all those protests and headlines. It is £2.5 million per individual, or £5 million for a married couple with anything above that threshold subject to the reduced 50% relief and the resulting effective 20% inheritance tax rate. So, does that mean the crisis is over? Not entirely, and this is the part of the story that often gets lost once the initial headlines fade. Even with a threshold that has been more than doubled, tax advisors and estate planning solicitors are still urging farming families to take the issue seriously and to plan carefully. Land values continue to rise. A farm that comfortably sits under the new £2.5 million threshold today might not sit under it in 5 or 10 years' time, especially if that farm includes a farmhouse, significant machinery, a large livestock operation, or diversified business activities alongside the core agricultural land. Advisors are increasingly stressing the importance of accurate, professional valuations, warning that families and executors need to be able to defend their figures if HMRC ever challenges them during probate. Getting a valuation wrong, in either direction, can create serious complications during an already difficult and emotional time for a grieving family. There are also strategies. Farming families are now being encouraged to explore well ahead of time rather than waiting until it's too late. One option involves gradually transferring assets to the next generation during a person's lifetime, rather than waiting until death, which can take advantage of separate tax rules around lifetime gifting. But this comes with its own complications, particularly around something advisors describe as a double tax trap. If a farmer gifts land to their children but then dies within 7 years of making that gift, inheritance tax can still apply. And separately, gifting assets can sometimes trigger capital gains tax considerations down the line if those assets are later sold, meaning families need genuinely careful professional planning rather than rushed decisions made out of panic. Other families are exploring specialized life insurance policies specifically designed to cover a future inheritance tax bill, essentially ensuring against the very risk this whole policy created, so that if a large tax liability does eventually arise, there's a lump sum available to pay it without touching the land itself. Careful will planning, correct structuring of ownership between spouses, and reviewing trust arrangements have all become far more central to conversations happening on kitchen tables across rural Britain than they ever were before October 2024. There's also a quieter, more emotional shift happening alongside all this technical planning. Conversations that families used to avoid about what happens after a parent dies, about who actually takes over the farm, about whether a sibling who left for the city has any claim on land they never worked, are now happening earlier and more openly than they used to. In a strange way, some advisors say the policy change has forced a kind of honesty onto families who might otherwise have put off these difficult discussions indefinitely. Wills that hadn't been updated in decades are being reviewed. Assumptions that were never actually written down are being tested. For some families, that has been painful. For others, it has brought a surprising amount of clarity, a chance to actually plan deliberately for succession rather than simply assuming the farm would somehow sort itself out when the time came. What makes this story so compelling and honestly so important is that it sits at the intersection of so many different tensions running through modern Britain. There's the tension between raising government revenue in a country facing serious fiscal pressure and protecting an industry that quite literally feeds the nation. There's the tension between closing a genuine tax avoidance loophole, exploited by the ultra-wealthy, and avoiding collateral damage to ordinary working families who happen to own valuable land simply because land itself has become extraordinarily expensive. There's the tension between London-based policymakers who see a spreadsheet showing 500 wealthy estates and rural communities who see grandmothers, cousins, and sons being told their family's multi-generational way of life might not survive the next inheritance. And there's a deeper, slower-moving tension, too, about who actually owns the British countryside, and whether policy decisions made in Westminster budget rooms will end up accelerating the very trend they claim to be fighting against: land shifting away from families who work it and toward whoever has the deepest pockets to buy it. The government ultimately moved a significant distance from where it started. Raising the threshold 2.5 times over and introducing spousal transferability genuinely does shield a large majority of working farms that would otherwise have been caught by the original proposal. That is not a small concession, and it's worth acknowledging honestly rather than pretending nothing changed. But for the farms that remain above even this higher threshold, and for the families watching land values climb year after year, wondering whether their farm will cross that line by the time it actually needs to be passed down, the underlying anxiety hasn't disappeared. It has simply been pushed further down the road. The 40-year-old promise that a working farm could pass from parent to child without government interference is genuinely gone, replaced by a more limited, means-tested version of that same promise. Whether that turns out to be a fair and necessary modernization of an outdated tax loophole or the beginning of a slow erosion of family farming in Britain is a question that will likely take another decade or two of land sales, generational transfers, and quiet kitchen table conversations to properly answer. For now, farming families across the country are doing what they have always done in the face of uncertainty: adjusting, planning, and trying to hold on to land that, in many cases, has been in their family for longer than the tax code itself has existed. And perhaps that's the most honest way to end this story, not with a clean resolution, but with an ongoing negotiation between a government trying to balance its books and a community trying to protect something that was never really about money in the first place. Ask almost any farmer why they do this work, and very few will talk about profit, margins, or asset values. They'll talk about the land itself, about continuing something their parents started, about wanting to hand over not just a business, but a legacy to whoever comes next. That is precisely why a tax policy, something as dry and bureaucratic as a change to a relief threshold, managed to provoke tractors on the streets of London and grown men telling reporters their own children should walk away from the only life they've ever known. It was never simply about 20%. It was about whether Britain still values the people who grow its food enough to let them keep the land they grow it on. The threshold may have doubled, the anger may have quieted, but the underlying question, the whole saga forced into the open about who the countryside ultimately belongs to, and who gets to keep farming it in the decades ahead, is still very much unresolved. Whatever happens next, one thing is already certain. The way Britain thinks about land, inheritance, and the true cost of feeding a nation has changed permanently, and it will not change back.